record, that now many state governments are, shall we say, turning up the heat on, hey, if we need to recoup some lost tax revenue, let's go after small businesses, because we all know that a lot of these independent contractors that are not paying their taxes, we can hold the businesses that pay them responsible and call them employees and get all that withholding, and then we'll refill our coffers. Have I explained the basic theory there, Tim? Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah, and we'll just say that the heat is on. We get to look at production companies and talk to them over our large scale. We're looking at nearly 60 production companies on a regular basis. So we look at patterns and when they become very apparent, we like to just call them out, let people know what's happening. And this is one of them. The audit game has basically increased a lot, starting into last year, going into this year. And more recently, I've been reading and listening to lawyers talking about this as well. So it's really easy to draw the conclusions. Obviously, these larger states, New York and California, they've got a major financial hit. They're going to try to find out where their money comes from. And a lot of long backlogs of laws that have been passed have allowed them to do this. Most specifically, the gig economy laws that they went after Uber and Lyft and those companies. But really, those companies might have Wall Street behind them, and they've taken the same laws and the same opportunities and come after these other entities they've been looking at that are heavy on freelancers. And of course, our industry is heavy that way. So it's at our doorstep.
Well, I remember this one moment when I was running Impossible Pictures where the state suddenly called me and said, you're being audited and a person is showing up next week in your office. They're going to have a special little badge and you need to sit them down in front of your computer and open up all your files to them. Thank you and have a nice day. This was so offensive to me. And I hope this is not what owners are facing today, but I'm worried that either you or Jason is going to say, yep, that's what can happen.
Well, Jason's gone through a few of these audits. We're specifically talking about the audit where they're auditing your freelancers and staff ratios. It's not your full financial audit. There's a very specific audit they go after. And Jay, you've done this multiple times.
Yeah, I've been through too many audits. Essentially, it is one of those moments. Joel, it's not the phone call, but from the chair that I get, it's usually the owner sending me some expletive-laced attachment that says, "What do I do now?" And it's a notice from the Employment Development Department, or whatever the corresponding agency is in the state, and it's essentially says, "Buckle up, because we want your records." And that's kind of where you get started.
Okay, so let's talk in practical terms because we're going to keep this hopefully to 30 minutes. So if I'm an owner, I guess question one is, what's the real issue at stake here or in play? Okay, so one of you guys can kind of help just give us the context and like what's sort of the best practice right now for here's where to look for information, here's what we should be thinking about as owners so that we're not at some risk or have some sort of exposure of penalties, paying back taxes, all this kind of stuff. And then I think part two, we can then sort of talk about if you do get that call and you are about to write that that expletive laced email to Jason or one of us, what should you do if an audit arises? So, and maybe just question one.
Let me do this. Maybe I'll do the setup, and Jay, you can talk about some of the details. The conclusions are easy to draw. Pretty much, a production company, in our case, hires freelancers, and one company hires multiple freelancers. The storyline supposedly is that these freelancers are their separate LLCs. They have their own LLC. Therefore, they're a separate corporation. Just like if you wrote a check to Amazon.com, they're not going to call that a freelancer. Why can't I give it to, JasonFletcher.com or whatever, Jason Fletcher LLC? in reality, just because they have an LLC or S Corp or whatever that the entity they have doesn't necessarily hold back this opportunity from you having to pay their Social Security tax and other taxes. And that's what the laws have changed. Like the LLC by itself, a separate entity by itself, is not a good enough reason or a good enough barrier between your corporation and their corporation. And again, the reason is very easy. If they go after your business, they find 7, 8, 10, 12, 20 freelancers. If the law were the other way, they'd have to go after 20 separate freelancers to determine something. And here's the catch. If you should be paying this person as a staff person, then the gross pay that you pay them, 100% of that is taxed. If you pay it to them as a separate entity, that person gets to write off expenses and then accrue tax. So the state makes less tax dollars if they allow this exchange to take place. And in a state like California, where we have Silicon Valley plus Hollywood, which are heavy in freelancers, the state was just losing too much tax revenue, same as New York City. So the state has cracked down on this, and they created a different criteria. One of the criteria that's called the ABC criteria, and it's just 3 basic principles to determine if the person should have been staff or freelance. Again, regardless of entity, should have been staff or freelance. And that's the first criteria they're going for, and that's the audit. Do you have people out there that don't pass this muster, the ABC muster? And if so, we will require you to have paid them as a staff person. Therefore, all the back taxes that you had not paid them over the last years, you owe them today. And that's the hit.
And tell us, do you have those basic ABCs? Is that something you can read or share a link or something?
Yeah, I'll share the link. The ABCs are pretty simple. They're actually 2 tests, the ABC test, and it works like this. The ABC test, it has like a basic criteria, and then there's a 12-point test. And what has happened is a lot of us have been using the ABC test, the 3-point test, and specifically California has been going after the 12-point test. So it got more complicated. But the 3 points, it works like this. The worker is free from control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with their performance of work, both under the contract of performance and in fact. So very simply, like they're their own boss. You can't tell them when to show up to work, where to sit, what projects to work on, that kind of stuff. So first one, very hard to pass. The second one works like this. The worker performs work that's outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. So if you're a motion design company and you're hiring a plumber, freelancer. If you're a motion design company and you hire a motion designer, that person be a staff person. And the last one is worker is customarily engaged in independent established trade, occupation, or business that's in the same nature as involved in the performance. In other words, if they that what they do all day long is work as a motion designer, then you can't say, oh, no, they're only doing this in a one-off deal. No, that's what they do for a living. So when they work for you, when they're a DP for a living, that's what they do for you. You can't call them something else. They would establish that. Gotcha. The 12-point test basically expands that even further. But again, just take those 3. Most of us already know, probably don't really pass the test.
And if I remember correctly, it's if you don't pass any one of these A, B, or C, or if you don't pass any one of these 12, it's not the classic, I'd have to be guilty of all 12. It's like, no, if you only don't meet the standard on one of these, then it's like, that person's classified as an employee.
Yeah, it's just one. All they need to do is one, and then they're classified as an employee.
Okay, so I'm people are already dropping some comments and stuff here. I was noticing Jed's comment, which is sort of a classic story of like, if you're doing live action like Jed does, I started paying all crew as employees through a payroll company 5-ish years ago. And he's saying, I'm glad I had that in place. But notice it adds about 25% cost. Of course, yes, you're right. It's worth it because if you get stuck with that bill, you're obviously in a world of hurt. But
Jason could tell you some of the best practices. I think payroll service is one of the kind of best practices, right, Jay? Is that what people are doing?
100%.
And does that, Jay, does that in New York, California, all other states, is that like a generally like, if people did nothing else, at least consider and evaluate and talk to a payroll company?
The payroll company would solve really the audit. It transfers the audit responsibilities from and really from you to the payroll company. But the payroll company is getting all of the taxes, everything and they're just billing you for them. So
yeah. So let's talk about the 25% increase, because it's something you have to wrap your mind around a little bit of how you're going to deal with it. When you pass the liability from your company to a payroll company, you're also passing the burden and the expense to that company as well. So your company currently has insurance and pay unemployment insurance. You don't pay that anymore for those employees that the payroll company has. So it is an increase of cost out of pocket, but it should decrease some expenses in-house. And you should know the difference when you do that. You're also taking the burden off of, like, we'll say, like the lawyer fees, the CPA fees, and that kind of stuff in the case of an audit. You've actually moved it to a different criteria over there. The last one, and this is probably one everyone should be very clear about, is that the freelancer always had the liability of these taxes. So we should make clear as possible, there are no new taxes being introduced. The rate or the amount that the tax was calculated against might be different because of how the pay is adjusted when it comes from you on staff, opposed to having expenses reduced first. But the tax itself is the same. The most confusing part people have is that the employer tax. So when you transfer the liability from your company to a freelancer, that freelancer had the employee and the employer tax, both of them do. It was their liability, not yours. When you take on that in your company, my belief is you should adjust that freelancer's rate, because it was never their money anyways. It was just handed to them and they had the tax liability. So for me, that's going to be what's going to be tricky for business owners to navigate, is how do we adjust the rates of this person so they're not making the exact same day rate after taxes that they were making pre-tax. And freelancers have to kind of adjust that. Now, this isn't the business owner's responsibility or even fault. This is what the government is doing. And when you elect your government officials, this is what you elected, right? For them to take care of these kind of things. So just keep that in mind of, like, the burden is not yours. I don't want you to take on the burden that the government has placed on the freelancer and that person's liability onto yourself, and assume all those expenses. And then when you work with a payroll company that might have more expense, I believe some of that should be accrued on the freelancer as well. Because that freelancer could set up a criteria of their own payroll company. They could go through and take on the additional expense themselves if they wanted to keep and control more of it. But if they're not taking on that responsibility, and therefore you have to create a liability for yourself, like, that's their job, not yours. Otherwise, like, just pay them, like, give them a staff rate, the same staff rate you pay your other staff people. That's the adjustment I think most of us are going to kind of negotiate.
Okay, so now let me challenge you and Jason with what reality looks like, because everything you just explained to me is right. It's correct. But now the owner is in a position of having to explain, defend, justify to a freelancer who might be saying, nope, the rate's the rate. That's my rate. Like, no, that doesn't sound right. No, that can't be. Like, this is how it's always been. This is how I do it. And so the difficulty is, as an owner. So Jay, like when you think of your clients that have been audited and they're having to improve their process, is there some sort of a standard operating procedure or a piece of paper that the freelancers need to sign? Like, if you were just going to dumb it down and be like, implement some sort of a basic policy, and that doesn't lead to all kinds of arguing and debating, because obviously freelancers are an incredible, valuable, critical resource for most people. So how do we not jeopardize those relationships, even though, like Tim said, they need to take responsibility for what they are legally responsible for?
Right. And I guess it's a really different, and one of the things that strikes me about this, Joel, is the evolving conversation around this. But one thing that has been constant is that the only penalty is on the studio. The penalty is never on, it's not on the individual. So you could even have misclassified an individual and not paid their, their employer tax, paid them in 1099. They could have paid their taxes like a good Boy Scout or Girl Scout. And then it doesn't matter. The results of the audit are that individual was paid as a, as a freelancer and should have been an employee. They're going to ding you for the taxes anyway, even though they're already paid. So it used to be around how do we still eat our cake, have the freelancers, how do we do that without getting in trouble? And the reality is, even using the corporation or the LLC, you're seeing the concentric circles of laws and regulations. So it's almost just not worth it anymore for a small studio to employ a freelancer as an individual at all. But again, the penalties that we face are all geared towards us. So explaining that to the freelancer, I mean, Tim, what's the Jedi mind trick on that one?
Yeah, it is a tricky thing because it's never been the freelancer's liability, and you're trying to make them step up to the responsibility that they had. There's going to be a tipping point where more and more people adopt these regulations and these practices. The rates should, as all markets, should correct themselves, and the freelancer or the person that is we'll say like a day laborer now, right? As day staff day laborer, that person's rate should adjust to match that, or your client's paid more, right? But that market's going to adjust itself out as these practices could become more and more widespread.
Yeah.
We should keep in mind, by the way, this might be something of interest, is if you're an entity outside of California that might or might not have as strict of government regulations or people coming after you, but you still employ people within California, California will come after you. They'll come after you for only the freelancers that you hired that came from within their state, and you'll be liable for that group of people. So if you are in another state or even another country and you hire somebody and the state wants to do it, they have the right to do that. So just keep in mind, just your entity being, even if you live in California, you have a Delaware LLC and you're hiring California freelancers in your Delaware LLC, that doesn't cut around it. You're going to have to step up and do it.
Remember the old slogan for Texas? It's like a whole other country. I think that's now California's slogan.
Yes.
It's like,
I think it meant something different. I think the "Don't mess with Texas" was a little bit of.
now it's "Don't mess with California."
The other way.
Don't mess with California. Okay, so here's a practice that I had. I'm curious if you think this is modern, because I'm going to go back maybe 10 or so years. I remember creating a checklist where my producers, whenever they would engage a freelancer, we had a simple checklist, and it was a folder with a piece of paper in it. Okay, that's how old we're talking. But it was a checklist that just said, did you engage the freelancer, and was this mentioned? Did they sign this thing? Did you settle on a rate? I mean, whatever that thing was, but it was the idiot-proof thing, such that when that folder was handed to my bookkeeper, that person would go to cut that person's check. And if that checklist wasn't check, it was like hard stop.
Yeah.
The producer would then be like, hey, freelancer, I've got your check for you, but we can't release it until I check all these boxes. Let's get this taken care of. Good idea, bad idea?
It's kind of, I think that's kind of old fashioned. I think AB 5, which is what happened last year in 2019 with the Uber law, really just made it so difficult for anyone to get around that you couldn't, again, like, just think of this one thing: the worker performs work that's outside the usual work of your company. Just like that one criteria alone, like there is no more checklist of like, yeah, but did you pay your own taxes? And that's the key. Now, I'll say, like, you can still outsource. Like, don't be afraid of that. And there are criteria that you can walk through, but I would work closely with your CPA or lawyer just so you know exactly what those terms are. But one entity that has multiple employees and doing a certain amount of work, that outsourced to another entity. It happens all the time. They're called your clients. Your clients are an entity that outsourced to you. So that same ability exists for you as well, but you're just gonna have to walk through like what that liability is, how that exchange works, and how you can more easily prove of like, no, I didn't hire an individual. I hired a company. They have 5 employees. They have their own entity. They sit at their own desk. They control their own workload. I passed it through to them or something like that. So like if you're a motion design house and you pass through to cost to a sound company, that sound company is not your freelancer. So keep that in mind.
So what I'm hearing is maybe the modern, like the thought now is when you're hiring an individual that we would call a freelancer, the rule of thumb now has shifted to either pay that person through a payroll company or pay them through your own payroll. That's got to maybe become the default now until further notice, like until their status changes, they're running a full-blown company or they meet that criteria. Like, is that the default? It's just changed that much that now needs to be the standard operating procedure?
Well, I'll just say that I think that's the recommendation we're making.
Yeah.
Because what you probably aren't in the business of is, fighting tax audits and that kind of stuff. Like you actually just want to do the job you do. Our encouragement is like, find the best practices that work for you and then make sure that the expenses are appropriate. So the costs are lined up. And when you're negotiating with these day staff people, you are adjusting the rates to match as needed, as well as make sure you're passing on the costs to your clients for that, because you didn't change the law. The law is there. The market changed. You don't have to be the person in the middle being squished. So whatever the practice is, just make sure that you've lined up your costs and revenue to match that and make sure you're getting what you're worth and not taking on all the burden.
Okay, so we're going to run out of time here. And wow, in 3 minutes, I'll try and get to a couple questions. Here's a simple one.
I told Jason, by the way, that this time's going to go by really fast.
Yeah, we were like,
anything complicated, it almost like there's not enough time to dive into all of it.
Well, we'll post the replay on the community platform. So for those of you that are in our community, we can continue the conversation there. Jay, I'm looking at this question from Jose. Do you have thoughts on this one? If you're a California LLC and do work out of state, do you still need to run freelancers through payroll? My guess is, generally speaking, yes.
I mean,
yeah, Jose, were you going to add context? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I was just curious because I was literally having this very heated discussion about this very topic with a bunch of people. And I know that in California, especially because I do film stuff, and like if I hire a crew, I have to run through payroll now. Right. But if I do a shoot out of state in a state that does not have that labor law, can I do it the old way? Like,
you should be able to get away with that, because what California is going to do is look at him, basically individuals that were treated like employees based in California only. They're not going to look at the outside.
Okay. Yeah. Because I mean, it's not even an issue of whether they're going to get counted if they're in California. I know they will. The entire film industry is getting affected by this, and it's,
yeah.
But I'm trying to find ways around it because it's just way too much money.
Yeah. So Jose, the easy way to think of it is if the employee is not in California, that's not California's revenue to go after. So if you hired an Idaho person to work for you in Idaho, that California never had a right to that revenue, that expense or whatever, that's Idaho's problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, I freelance for companies in other states, like in Florida and states where they don't have a law, and they're paying me 1099. But it's like the ones in California have to pay me through payroll.
Yeah. But guess what? The 1099 in Florida is going to expire too at some point.
Yeah. So enjoy it while you can.
I guess so.
Enjoy it while you can.
Well, I saw this comment from Ed at Spilt. Thanks for sharing this, Ed, about saying they were audited in 2019. That 6 people were found to be or declared employees. But I like this. It says the Department of Labor was reasonable about it as long as we showed a change in policy and procedure. So that's interesting. Jay, I'm just curious from your experience, are those state departments of labor, like, do you get to deal with real people and actually talk about it and hopefully find some sort of a reasonable solution?
Yeah, well, let me just try to answer really quickly. First of all, it's been super chaotic. You get it in mail, and then 12 months later, you get some results with requests for more information. It's very chaotic dealing. That happened in New York with one of my clients last month. So, but essentially, what you want to do is you want to reach out to your CPA or your lawyer right away and say, "Hey, I got this note. Here's what it looks like," and they'll walk you through what's next.
But
Okay.
Jay, we'll say this too, like if you were proactive and you start putting policies in place before they issued the audit, and when they show up, you said, well, honestly, as of January 1st this year, we recognize this was the law. We've started doing this. You
Yeah.
might find more leniency when the time comes to issuing penalties than if they have to catch you and then work backwards. Because
Super agree with that. And I would say I've had a lot of success in lobbying for like a penalty abatement. So they collect all the tax that they deem is due, but they'll waive penalties oftentimes. Now, we'll see how it goes in a year.
All right. Well, we're 1 minute past our allotted 30 minutes. So I'm gonna wind this down. Well, I'll say for the moment, because this conversation is going to continue. Much like the going back to work post-COVID conversation that's still never ending in the community. But Tim, thank you so much for jumping in, and Jason, thank you also for jumping in. I was just going to post here for everyone in the community. If you're not a member, this is where you can follow that link and get information about how you can join. Tim, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, and I did put the link to the California website, the California Department of Labor website, so people can see that 12-point criteria if they want to know more. Again, our encouragement is talk to your CPA, talk to your lawyer now, be very proactive, and start the conversation with freelancers. It's going to be very interesting over the next few months, a year as it rolls out. The more people that adopt it, it'll become easier. So just jump in, take responsibility, and be as proactive as possible. Because the best way to deal with the future is to create it, right? So let's just know what it's going to take to get there and make sure we get there as we need to.
Amen. All right. Well, we're here to help you thrive in business and life and career and all that good stuff. So thanks for being part of this conversation, everyone. Thanks for jumping in. It was really good to have Jose jump in and talk to us live. So we'll pick this conversation up in the community. Until then, everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you back next week for another briefing. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.